Have you ever landed a job only to realize you can't start it? The contract side, the clock is ticking, and suddenly you're scrambling for insurance you don't have, paying more than you expected, and falling behind before you even begin. In this video, I'll show you how to make sure your insurance actually matches the contract requirements before you sign, how to spot the hidden language that can delay your job and blow up your coverage, and how to price out insurance costs up front so you don't take on a job that isn't even worth it. Let's say you land a solid contract with the municipality or a general contractor. Everything looks good. You're ready to go. So you send in your certificate of insurance and it gets rejected. Now you're being told you need higher limits, extra coverages, and specific wording you never had to deal with before. And here's the problem: you can't start the job until it's fixed. So now you're scrambling. You're calling your broker, you're trying to add coverages, you're waiting on quotes, and days turn into weeks. And meanwhile, the job that looked clean and profitable when you signed the contract is now delayed and it's getting more expensive by the day. And this is where a lot of people get it wrong. See, winning the job does not mean you're ready to do the job. You're not actually ready until your insurance matches the contract. So before you take on the next project, there are a few things you need to check. Most people think they're covered right up until the moment their certificate gets rejected. I see this happen all the time, especially with municipalities and larger organizations. You'll send in what you've always used, thinking everything's fine, and then it comes back with a list of requirements that you don't meet. Now you're being asked for higher limits or coverages you don't even carry. Maybe it's cyber liability, maybe it's pollution, maybe it's even sexual abuse coverage, or maybe it's a bigger umbrella. And none of that was part of your original plan when you priced the job. So what happens? Now you're trying to add coverage after the fact, and you're dealing with underwriters, you're waiting on approvals, and everything slows down. And here's the real issue: it's not just the delay, it's that when you're forced to buy coverage last minute, you lose all leverage. You don't have time to shop it properly, you don't have time to structure it the right way. You just need something that works and fast, which usually means you end up paying more than you should. So the takeaway here is simple: before you sign the contract, you need to line up the insurance requirements side by side with what you actually have. Because if you don't, you're not just risking a delay, you're risking the entire timeline and profitability of the job. And once you've got that part handled, there's another issue that trips people up even more, and it has nothing to do with limits. So this is where contracts get dangerous, and it's not the limits, it's the wording. Because a lot of these contracts are written in a way that sounds standard, but the actual requirements can be much broader than what your policy will do. You'll see things like additional insured requirements, waiver of subrogation, primary and non-contributory wording, and hold harmless language. And on paper, it looks like, okay, no problem. I've got a general liability policy. I should be fine. But that's not how it works. Your policy only does what it's written to do, and those contract requirements only count if your policy actually has the right endorsements and the right wording to back them up. So you can end up in this situation where both sides think everything is handled, but the coverage is either too narrow or too conditional or doesn't trigger the way the contract expects. And that's when things start getting kicked back. Now you're going back and forth trying to get endorsements issued. You're asking your broker if something can be added. You're waiting on approvals again. And in some cases, you may not even be able to comply exactly the way the contract is written. That's the part nobody talks about. Some of these contracts are written to shift as much risk as possible onto you, whether your insurance can actually support it or not. So the takeaway here is simple: don't just read the requirements and assume you're good. You need to confirm that your policy can actually satisfy the wording in the contract, not just the limits, but how the coverage is triggered. Because if point number one is about having the right coverage, this is about making sure that coverage actually works the way the contract expects. And once you understand that, there's another mistake that causes delays even when everything looks like it in place. Here's a big misconception that causes a lot of delays. Certificate of insurance does not mean you're compliant. And this is where people get tripped up, because from your perspective, you send in the certificate, it shows your limits, it shows your coverage. So you're thinking, okay, we're good. But from the other side, that certificate is just informational. It doesn't change your policy. It doesn't prove that the required endorsements are in place. And it definitely doesn't guarantee that your coverage matches the contract. So what happens? You send in the certificate and it still gets rejected. Now they're asking for copies of endorsements. They're asking for specific wording. They may even want to review parts of the policy. All of that has to be done and approved before you can start work. So even though you felt like you were done, you're not. Real compliance usually means three things are lined up: the certificate, the endorsements, and the policy language. If any one of those is missing and doesn't match what the contract is asking for, you're going to get stuck in that back and forth. And again, that costs you time. It delays the job. It frustrates everyone involved. And it puts you in a reactive position instead of being a proactive position and being ready to go. So the takeaway here is simple. Don't treat certificates like the finish line. It's just the starting point. And even if you get all of that right, there's still another layer to this that most people don't see coming. So there's another thing a lot of people don't think about when they're reviewing a contract. The insurance requirements don't always end when the job is done, because some of these contracts are written to protect the other party long after you've finished the work. So you might need all the insurance requirements to start the job, but you haven't thought about what's required after it's over. This shows up in a few different ways. One is completed operations coverage. They may require you to carry that coverage and prove it for years after the project is finished. Another one is claims made policies. If you're dealing with something like professional liability, the policy has to be active when the claim is made, not just when the work was done. So if the contract requires you to maintain coverage for 3, 4, or even 5 years after completion, that's a real cost you need to account for. And if you cancel the policy or switch it without thinking about it, you could lose that protection entirely unless you buy extended reporting, or what some people call tail coverage. Now, here's why this matters. When you're looking at a job, you're usually thinking about what it costs to do the work. But these requirements can extend your insurance costs well into the future. So a job that looks profitable up front might not look the same once you factor in what you're required to maintain after it's done. So the takeaway here is this: don't just ask, what do I need to start the job? Ask, what am I responsible for after the job is over? Because if you miss this, the cost doesn't hit you today, it hits you later. And there's one more piece to this that ties everything together. This is the one that protects your profit, because at the end of the day, you're not just trying to win jobs, you're trying to win the right jobs. And insurance can completely change whether a job makes sense or not. I've seen situations where someone signs a contract thinking it's a great opportunity, and then they find out what it actually costs to meet the insurance requirements, and they're adding higher limits, they're adding new coverage, they're adding endorsements, and all of that comes with a price. And sometimes that price is not small. Sometimes it's really big. And sometimes it's enough to wipe out your profit margins entirely. What should have been a profitable job turns into something you regret taking on. And here's the problem: once you've signed the contract, you don't really have an out. You either have to figure out how to meet the requirements or risk lo- losing the job, damaging the relationship, or both. So now you're stuck trying to make it work. That's why you have to flip the order. Before you sign anything, you need to scope out what it's going to take to meet the insurance requirements and what it's going to cost. That means talking to your broker early. That means getting a realistic estimate of pricing. And that means asking a simple question: does this still make sense once I factor in the insurance? Because if it doesn't, it's better to know that before you commit, not after. And if you get this part right, you avoid almost everything we talked about in this video: the delays, the back and forth, the last minute scrambling. Most of that goes away when you have this conversation up front. And if you want to make this process even easier, so you can look at a contract and immediately know what's going to be a problem, what's going to cost you money, and what you actually need to do next, then you need to understand what your general liability policy actually does, and more importantly, what it doesn't do. Because a lot of these contract issues come back to one thing: people think their policy covers more than it really does. So if you want to see how general liability actually works, where the gaps are, and how claims really play out in the real world, click right here and watch this video next.